Today, we're here to explore potential vulnerabilities in the data subject request process. And we'd love to help you talk about how you can implement a secure process that ensures data is protected while complying with various legislations required to delete, give a user access to their data, opt them out, whatever that may be. My name is Mike Farrell. I'm the CTO and the co-founder over here at Transcend.
And my name is Dave Matea. I'm a software engineer at Transcend on the information security team.
Awesome. And so, yeah, at a high level, as privacy requests increase worldwide, it's essential for companies to get security right for liability reasons, and more importantly, just to protect that user data from new attack vectors. That's why we put this learning session together. We want to help people detect potential vulnerabilities in the data subject request process and offer recommendations for how to shore up that security and ensure that your data privacy request process isn't another potential security hole. We'll cover the importance of validating user authentication, and we'll also dive into a few other ways to strengthen up your security across the board, from things like email verification to 2FA, everything in between. So let's dive in, covering some of the most significant vulnerabilities throughout the entire DSR process.
Yeah, and I'll take this one. So we're talking about DSR forms through the entire process. So this is receiving a submission from a user that they want to access or delete their data or any of the other data subject request types that they can submit, the process of actually collecting that data, whether that's through automation or manual processes or some combination of both, and then replying to the user with the data. At all points in this process, we want to make sure that we're using strong authentication, that we're valuing privacy and security for our users, as well as for our internal employees as much as we possibly can. And one of the things we're going to start talking about here is kind of the intake part of this process. So when you're receiving a DSR from an end user, you want to make sure that you are actually verifying who the user is before you start giving them their data. As an example, for something like a deletion request, you might want to really ensure that you're using strong authentication, because you don't want just any random person to email you and say, hey, could you delete the user account for XYZ at myaddress.com, unless you actually know who that person is. And depending on the type of DSR, for something like a contact opt-out, you might need a less formal form of authorization or authentication. But it's just something that you need to think about with each different type of DSR you take in. So talking about emails here, especially if this is going to be a human-driven process and not something done in automation, you really want to make sure that you're doing things like verifying incoming email headers, ignoring spam or handling spam in some way. You want to make sure that you're not kind of subject to those same sorts of vulnerabilities that you get trained out of in your phishing training compliance program that you probably have internally at your company. There's a reason those compliance trainings and programs exist, and it's because phishing does work. Especially we're at the end of March 2022 right now. There's a lot of very recent breaches that have happened just through phishing or spear phishing at companies specifically related to MFA tokens. But all of those same sorts of attack vectors that make people susceptible to phishing apply when intaking DSR forms. So just make sure that if you do take in DSRs through email, through like a support ad or a privacy email address at your company, that you really do your best to verify these forms with a great deal of rigor. So certain things you can do, yeah, spam check, apply the same authentication formats, no matter the input format. So one thing you can do is if you receive an email that you don't trust, you can redirect them to your website. It's important to remember that on your website, you can enforce things like MFA or strong logins, changing passwords, whatever it is you do to enforce authentication. But in an email, you're receiving that email from somebody who could be logging in through any format, and you have no idea, does their email have MFA? Does it have a strong password? Things like that. So all just things to keep in mind. The next slide. And so diving in a little bit more specifically into email requests, I talked kind of generally about spam before, but there are lots of attacks that are pretty common in phishing, especially if your company doesn't have strong checks on things like incoming SPF headers or DKIM, like encryption not being valid on the emails coming in. Spoofed emails can be really tricky, especially if you're depending on who is actually receiving these emails at your company, if they haven't gotten strong enough training in this area. But it's pretty commonplace for attackers to do something like send an email with the name on the from section of their email saying some name, but then if you check the actual headers on the email, the from address is a different address than they put on the envelope of that email. So it's really easy for somebody untrained to think, oh, this email is coming from this email address, when in fact it's not. And that's something that, again, you can try to train out in phishing, but what we really try to push at Transcend is this should really just be in automation as much as you can. It's a lot easier to encode these sorts of rules about who to trust, making sure that the correct headers are there and things, if you're doing it in an automated process, receiving these emails, as opposed to having manual steps for trying to make sure this verification never happens. Because it's just with all the different types of social engineering attacks that are out there and phishing attacks that are out there, it can be really hard to ensure you have 100% coverage if you don't have some sort of automation kind of protecting your systems.
Sweet. And maybe just dive into this last one here, like authorized agents. Authorized agents are really any sort of person that is submitting a request on behalf of another user. And that really does come into even more play in this next slide here. So determinism of user lookups. So whenever, once we actually receive that data request and we go and we validated the identity of the user, we want to go out and look up or delete data associated with that user. And that can be really complex. Like you might have a user with an account, you might have a user without an account. You have a bunch of different internal systems, a bunch of different SaaS tools. All of those systems make key data in different ways. And so, as important as it is to, authenticate those users up front, it's also important to if we want to continue to encode these rules across your stack, you'll have to look up that user in different systems in a deterministic way. So kind of maybe starting in the middle here, we need to ensure that any identifier that is looked up is verified by that end user. And so even if, an authorized agent is maybe initializing the request, it's always important to ensure that the actual user whose data we're processing for either a data access request or data erasure request, we get direct authentication from that user before performing that action or looking up any data associated with that identifier. So for example, if that's an email, we're going to go and maybe send a magic link to the email and give them like a 2FA confirmation that, hey, we're going to go and key data off this email and start deleting it across your stack. I think this is important as well, where say you have some form and you ask the user, say, what's your phone number? Because we have to go and look up data based on that form number. We should verify that the user actually truly does have access to that phone. Again, similar, I think David mentioned this earlier. If it's like a contact opt-out request, you might say, hey, we're going to assume the risk and say anyone can submit any phone number and we're going to opt it out just for safety. But if you're deleting data, or especially if you're returning data associated with those identifiers, it's crucial that each individual identity key is actually verified. And determinism of these user lookups, this also comes back to just the idea that any sort of place where a human is getting involved in a privacy request or data subject request process is an opportunity for failure and error and risk to come up within your process. So at Transcend here, we recommend to do deterministic lookups wherever possible. That means like if we're going to go and delete data from a SaaS tool, we're actually going to make sure that the email or the phone number or whatever identifier we verified is a direct hit on some piece of data in that tool. We recommend that for both internal systems and for your third-party systems. I think obviously there is a place and it is a problem of like unstructured data. You might have just random files that have emails inside of them and it's really not structured at all. I think it's important to get a grasp of this data, and either using different data mapping techniques, or even in your privacy request process, you can encode some automatic way of scanning for unstructured data. But you should be really careful about automating a process for something that's unstructured. If we can do something like verify an email, verify a phone number, verify a social security number, and key data off of that, then we can be pretty confident that some automated process is able to run without any hitch. But if we're fuzzy matching and it's like a search, like let's go into Slack and find any user emails that were dumped into a random message, there's a place for that, but it shouldn't be end-to-end automated. We should ensure that there is some level of manual intervention where someone can go in and ensure that, if Jeff at example.com submitted a request, that we're not fuzzy matching on Bob Jeff at example.com. There's weird like substring things that could go about, and other different attacks that could come up if you're trying to use a fuzzy matching or search-based approach in order to like fulfill a data subject access request. And yeah, so very similar to the last slide, or tying off a couple things that we just talked about. Really, any place in the process where a human is processing requests is an opportunity for risk and mistakes to happen. One example is like, let's go back to that email. Someone could read the email. In the email, they're like, I want to get a copy of my data, but your support agent, accidentally clicks or accidentally issues a deletion request because they either misread the email or whatever. Another example, someone just sends a really confusing email and you have no clue what they're saying. Maybe it's a compliance request and maybe you're at risk, but just the interpretation and like the reading of the language and translating that into a privacy request can be ambiguous. As that volume scales, as multiple people are processing and receiving these requests, there are plenty of opportunities for error there. Other potential human errors in the process, transferring inaccurate data to another team. So, say we're ingesting the request, we get an email in the request, we verify the email, we then create like a CSV and we send that CSV around to the 10 or 20 engineering teams within the company. There's a lot of opportunity there. Copy paste error is totally a thing. Like if you're doing hundreds of these a month or even dozens of these a month, the chance that you miss one, you accidentally forget to copy one, or you copy the same value twice, or you have a typo where user ID 12345 is plugged in as 54321. These things can happen all the time and really do there's a really big breach opportunity there where any sort of mistake could result in someone else's data getting deleted, or probably even worse, returning the data for user A to user B. And kind of last but not least, these processes are extremely sensitive. Like if we're going out and looking at data across the 100 different systems in your stack, and some support agent or some collection of support agents has access to all that information, there's opportunity for spying. Like there's opportunity for like looking at data that these should probably never even be looked at. If you have sensitive health information, or you have sensitive maybe it's like a dating profile or something of that sort, it's kind of best for a machine to be doing this. Like a machine is gonna preserve privacy. If someone's asking to delete their account or see their data, ideally your support agents also are not getting the ability to see all the data on that particular user. Next one.
Yeah, and just kind of going off that last point Mike made, diving a little further into your employees, as you're compiling results on the DSR process, at any point where you have an internal employee kind of like collecting data, like say it's an access request where somebody says, give me all my data. What you don't want to have happen, at least not too often if you can avoid it, is you don't want to have your, say, support employees collecting all that data, going in, let's get their data from this database over here, this database over here, grab some data from some SaaS tools, and just kind of throw in a little report into like some sort of Google Drive or some sort of document that's being passed around between different support engineers that just has all of the user information about the user you're compiling the report for. In a lot of ways, that can actually then become sort of a data store, right? Like so much of modern information security deals with labeling of where is the data in your system, how sensitive is it, things like that. You don't want to take this process of compiling an access, deletion request, et cetera, and have that turn into a place where you're kind of centralizing all of the most sensitive data through all of the different systems you interact with and bringing it to some place that has significantly less sort of internal controls about who has access to that data, as you might have had before that data was queried from your databases and from the different SaaS tools. So this becomes the source of some really significant kind of liabilities that your company can come across if you now have to protect all of this additional data. So one, try to make sure that you're really strongly limiting access if you have any manual steps. But then regardless of whether it's manual or in automation, at some point, if you're going to eventually send a report to a user, you have to store that data somewhere. It could be an internal database. It could be, as I said, in something like Google Drive. If it's a more manual process. But however you do it, you want to have extreme control over auditing access to that data and restricting access to that data to not just make sure that only certain people have access, but that the people who do have access to that data are using it properly. You want to make sure that there's not a case where somebody says, oh, I know this person who submitted a DSR, and I'm not saying that necessarily would happen, but there have been cases in other industries where, when groups have access to large amounts of data on kind of the general public or general users of their company, that can cause some very bad cases to happen at the end of the day, where somebody maybe looks at information they shouldn't have, and that can become a security risk, not just to your company, but sort of an external risk as well, that might need other involvement from law enforcement or et cetera. So the key idea here is just with the employee backdoor is, as you're implementing these processes, make sure that by doing something good, right, by doing something to the letter of the law and useful to your users in fulfilling DSRs, that you're not introducing a less secure process and introducing vulnerabilities and access control risks that you didn't have before, to the extent that you can limit them.
Great, thanks, David. Yeah, so we just talked about a bunch of different security risks involved in the data subject request process. Now we kind of want to dive into just different ways of actually enforcing user authentication and building this process securely. So the first thing we always recommend to everyone that has to deal with these requests is to move that process into a form. As much as you can, if you can also make the judgment that, hey, we're just going to completely cut out requests by email. A lot of times we actually recommend that. Just sort of like we touched on earlier, there's a lot of potential human error when receiving requests by email, and also just potential risk of not ensuring that you've properly verified the user to whatever standard you want to hold. So we recommend moving the data subject request process into a secure form. That can be on your website, that can be on a second website, but all of the options that a user has available when making a privacy request, whether that's an opt-out, email, access request, should be encoded into a form. Any sort of input you might need to fulfill that process should also be in that form. So if that's additional identifiers or additional information, allow them to submit that in a structured manner so that a machine can then work on that from then on out. And then you can encode processes where if we're taking that email and putting it into a CSV for another team to process it, a human's not doing that. That can be done in a fully automated fashion. And here, it's also nice to just enumerate all those choices, like sort of what we touched on earlier, like having someone, whether a support agent or a legal person, interpreting an email as a privacy request. There's a lot of risk there, just in terms of this was a privacy request, but I didn't interpret it as that, as well as encoding the wrong thing. So
yeah, and so Mike was talking about you want to really structure these forms, and you want to be the one in charge of that structure. So when we talk about the authentication, one of the biggest ways, we've mentioned this a few times now, but really just to reiterate it, because it's one of the central messages here, it's you want to have one of that structured inputs be the login, and you want to control, as an example here, as this slide's talking about, you want to control the 2FA. Certain users, depending on, like, they might submit a deletion request after clicking the sign up button, but before adding their MFA token, right? Like there's all sorts of tricky cases, again, with marketing opt-outs. If you emailed somebody who maybe doesn't have an account, that you have to watch out for. So this isn't a rule, unfortunately, that can be applied everywhere. But using MFA in whatever way your company supports to the strongest level you can on any case where you can, on any sort of very sensitive deletion request, access request, things like that, becomes so critically important. I talked a little bit ago about the risk of kind of internal employee access, but significantly worse than internal employees potentially having access, which is certainly a problem, would be external parties having access to this data. So you absolutely want to ensure using 2FA, using sometimes even more factors than you include in your normal login flow, that the person talking to you is who they say they are, so that you're not sending some user's data to an attacker or somebody entirely different in the world. That is a very, very, very bad case if that were to happen.
Yeah, and maybe just to jump off on that a little bit, one of my favorite, like, 2FA steps, and even if you don't want to enforce the 2FA every time, just sending an email and delaying the process by a couple hours or a couple days is a great way to just, double check and just say, hey, someone on your account just submitted a deletion request with this email. Was this you? And you could still let the request go through automatically, but having that secondary email notification and the opportunity for someone to come in and cancel that request if they didn't make it is a great way. Sometimes I've seen, my brother logged into my account and accidentally submitted this request, and there's simple ways to protect against something like that. Continuing through. So the next one is just ensuring that your systems get structured in a deterministic way that can avoid those fuzzy lookups. When you're going out and looking up this user across your SaaS tools, across your databases, ensuring that process can be done, with direct matching on these key identifiers. So whether that's looking up users by user ID, looking them up by email, by IDFA, advertising ID. These are keys that are often, deterministic, and we can go and look those up. For systems where, PII is not structured, think a Google Doc, a Google Sheet, a Jira ticket, Slack. Like I said, there is a place for scanning those systems and finding unstructured data. However, the most common approaches we actually see are, searching those systems, but then when data is actually found in that system, it's normally like, let's clean this up. Like, let's go to the team that's programmatically dumping data into Slack or some Google Sheet and just be like, hey, can we move this into another place where we can have access to it and manage the compliance aspect of that data in a deterministic way, so we're not guessing and having the opportunity to either return someone else's data, add manual steps to a privacy request process, or not returning the wrong data or keying the wrong data because it was a fuzzy match.
And for this last slide, I just want to focus on, we focused before on don't let your internal employees access all this very sensitive data. Don't let external attackers access this data. The last thing I want to stress, and this is regardless of whether you're working with Transcend or any other company in the DSR automation space, is really make sure that if you use any sort of SaaS company to help with this DSR automation process, that you're choosing a company and picking the options that will not turn that SaaS company into another potential vulnerability that you have to monitor. We're talking about sort of compiling the culmination of all of the PII that you have in every other system combined, right? If you're using, maybe you record customer support calls, maybe you receive emails, maybe you process payment information and have order histories. The importance of picking the right security model for the company that's going to automate your DSR process is absolutely critical, just because it's probably potentially more important than any other vendor that you will choose, simply because It's the combination of your PII and all of the other systems put together in some of these types of access or deletion requests that ends up getting touched and potentially sent through this third party. So when you're picking a third party, make sure that as best as you can, you're retaining ownership of your API keys, that you don't have to start uploading API keys that might have read-write access to all of your SaaS tools that you use, or your internal databases, things like that. As best you can, try to find or use a product that's going to have end-to-end encryption, like Transcend offers. We offer something like we call it the on-premise security gateway, but it's our way where we actually let you run a server on your premise that can retain your API keys, and then any calls that are being made through Transcend, Transcend only deals with encrypted data by API keys within your cloud account or on-premise environment. And what this does is it's getting into the buzzword section here, but it's getting into that zero trust stance of, if you are only sending data that's encrypted to Transcend or any other DSR automation provider, and that company doesn't have access to the keys to decrypt that user data, that should just be a huge load off your back. It's a significant area that you no longer have to worry about. You no longer have to worry about as much about audit or access rules for who is accessing that data if you just don't give them access in the first place. But going beyond that, in cases where you do have to trust an external company a little bit, maybe this is a company that doesn't use end-to-end encryption, or using Transcend on some tiers where you get slightly less guarantees, or you want Transcend to host the entire system for you, you still need to make sure that you're then having a good deal of audit access and monitoring access to who is using your data. If you have internal employees who are kind of in that support role helping out with this DSR process, and you want them to be able to log into a company like Transcend to access information about these DSRs as they're going through, it's sort of similar to that Google Drive situation we talked about earlier, where you want to make sure you have really strict access control setups, and Transcend, we offer like very specific role-based and API key-based permissioning systems. You want to make sure you have audit logs. Another thing that Transcend has, so this will show audit logs of everything that Transcend is doing, touching data in this system when it's moving it around, even in the encrypted format. But also when you are looking at what are your users doing, whose DSR reports are they using, who's logging in and looking at this data. All that sort of information can be critical to making sure that this extremely sensitive data gets protected to the level that it should be.
Awesome. Thanks so much, David. So yeah, that's really all we had today. Thank you for listening to our security learning session. If you're interested in booking a security consult to help identify any vulnerabilities in your DSR process, we're offering a $100 Amazon gift card just for booking the meeting. We love this. We've been doing this for many years now, and have seen the ins and outs of all potential vulnerabilities in the process. And so, we'd love to chat, even if Transcend's not a fit for you. Thanks for listening. See ya.